On November 30, 1943, in the dim basement of the Soviet embassy in Tehran, a silence hung heavy as Marshal Georgy Zhukov's pen froze mid-strokes. He was about to sign an operational report, yet the words circling in his mind would never make it into any official Soviet record. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. Our armies are moving on American wheels. From a small window, the rumble of American-built Studebaker engines echoed through the streets of Tehran. Their convoys loaded with supplies for the historic conference where Stalin would meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that moment, the Red Army's most celebrated commander faced a truth so profound it would remain hidden in classified files for decades. The Soviet war machine, driving the Germans back toward Berlin, was fueled by American trucks, powered by American gasoline, and fed with American food. Hours later, during a private toast, even Stalin himself would quietly admit what no public speech ever revealed: without this aid, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. American trucks and jeeps poured into Soviet hands through three perilous lifelines: the icy Arctic convoys, the vast Persian corridor, and the Pacific route. By the war's end, the Soviets had received more vehicles from the United States than they themselves produced during the entire conflict, more trucks than most nations possessed in total. These machines transformed the Red Army from a force that once trudged forward on foot and horse-drawn wagons into a mechanized avalanche capable of sustaining offensives across front lines stretching thousands of miles. What the Soviet officers in Tehran could never have imagined was that their private acknowledgments of this aid were being recorded not only by American note takers but also by their own NKVD agents. Those classified transcripts would one day stand in direct contradiction to decades of propaganda about the so-called Great Patriotic War. The real story of Soviet transportation, however, began in disaster. On June 22, 1941, as 3.8 million Axis soldiers stormed across the Soviet frontier in Operation Barbarossa, they found an army unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. The Red Army's truck fleet, roughly 700,000 vehicles, was built around outdated designs. The GAZAAA copy of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5 adapted from 1920s American trucks. Within 6 months, nearly 40% of this fleet lay destroyed or captured. The numbers exposed a grim reality. In 1941, the Soviet Union managed to build only 124,000 trucks, yet lost nearly 300,000 in the same year. The nation's primary truck factory in Gorky had to be dismantled and shipped east as German armies closed in, while the Zits factory in Moscow was hastily converted to tank production with the Wehrmacht at the city's gates. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies were reduced to marching on foot, their artillery dragged by horses when horses could even be found. In the desperate Zhukov pocket, the Second Shock Army lost 95% of its transport in a failed breakout attempt. The Soviet war machine was on the brink of collapse. On the Eastern Front, the situation had become desperate. Soldiers were reduced to carrying artillery shells on their backs for guns that could no longer be moved. This was the broken Red Army that American aid would soon transform, though. Soviet leaders would wait nearly 40 years before ever admitting it. The Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads had revealed the brutal truth of modern warfare: victory depended on speed, mobility, and logistics. The Red Army, despite its vast manpower, was repeatedly outflanked and encircled. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized trudged across endless miles on foot. Artillery batteries that demanded prime movers instead relied on exhausted horses, animals that perished by the thousands in the unforgiving Russian winter. Then, on October 1, 1941, in the frozen port of Arkhangelsk, hope arrived in the form of steel. The British convoy PQ-1 crept into harbor under Arctic darkness, unloading 20 American-built trucks, the first of what would soon become a flood. For Soviet drivers accustomed to machines that broke down as often as they moved, these Chevrolets with their enclosed cabs and dependable engines seemed nothing short of miraculous. By November, as German forces stood only 12 miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were already arriving at a rate of 2,000 per month through multiple routes. The Persian corridor, expanded sixfold under the supervision of American engineers, turned Iran's railways into a vital artery of war. The Pacific route, though restricted to non-military supplies due to Soviet neutrality with Japan, still delivered thousands of vehicles, and the perilous Arctic convoys, braving U-boat wolf packs and relentless Luftwaffe assaults, continued to carry precious cargo into Soviet ports. The trucks themselves were a leap into another world. The Studebaker US-6 boasted 6-wheel drive, all 6 wheels powered, compared to the Soviet ZIS-5, which relied on just 2. Its 94-horsepower engine outclassed the Soviets' 73 most impressively. The Studebaker carried its own self-recovery winch, able to drag itself free from the mud that would trap Soviet trucks until spring thaw. Every vehicle arrived fully equipped: 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks, tire repair gear, and meticulously numbered spare parts catalogs. By contrast, a Soviet truck came with little more than a handful of basic tools, if it came with any at all. The Americans had considered every detail. Their trucks arrived with cold weather starters, cabin heaters that truly worked, and sealed electrical systems that did not fail in rain or snow. For Soviet soldiers, it felt as if these machines were built for the Russian front itself. At the Tehran Conference, held between November 28 and December 1, 1943, one of the most remarkable admissions in Soviet history was spoken aloud, though it would remain locked in American archives until 1961 and censored in the Soviet Union until 1989. On the evening of November 30th, during a private dinner attended only by Roosevelt, Churchill, and their closest advisors, Joseph Stalin rose to deliver a toast. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt, interpreter, Stalin admitted plainly, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things are the machines. The United States can produce 8 to 10,000 airplanes each month. Russia can only manage 3,000. The United States is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, later recorded in his diary that Stalin had emphasized trucks in particular during technical discussions. The Soviet leader praised the American Studebakers as the best vehicles for Russian conditions, calling them the very foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet only 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin publicly dismissed Lend-Lease as minor, claiming it represented no more than 10% of Soviet production. This lie became official orthodoxy, enforced by censors and echoed by historians who valued their careers and their lives above historical truth. The Tehran records revealed even more striking confessions. Marshal Klim Voroshilov told American logisticians, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks." These were words never meant for public ears, spoken by men who, in speeches, credited only Soviet industry for victory. To grasp why American trucks mattered so profoundly, one must understand the brutal arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single rifle division in offensive operations required 450 tons of supplies every day: ammunition, food, fuel, and medicine. In defense, it still consumed 300 tons. A tank corps demanded more than 1,000 tons daily. Moving such mountains of supplies from railheads to distant front lines across Russia's primitive road network was impossible without trucks. Major General Andrei Krylev, the Red Army's chief of logistics, calculated the numbers in 1943. His classified report, buried until 1991, revealed that the Red Army needed at least 450,000 trucks to conduct sustained offensive operations. From January to September that year, Soviet factories produced just 49,000. In the same period, American deliveries totaled 94,000. Without those vehicles, Soviet forces could not advance more than 50 kilometers beyond their rail lines, and the difference was not only in numbers but in quality. Soviet trucks like the ZIS-5 or the GAZAA were rated for 2.5 to 3 tons, yet they often broke down if asked to carry more than 1.5 tons on rough front roads. By contrast, the American Studebaker US-6, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely hauled 5 tons on paved roads and 3 tons across open country. Its average service life stretched to 10,000 kilometers, 5 times longer than a Soviet truck. The superiority of American trucks was more than just reliability, it was innovation. These vehicles carried features Soviet engineers had never imagined: air brakes that functioned in any weather, lightweight aluminum pistons that boosted performance, oil filters that actually purified, and thermostats that kept engines running at optimal temperature. By contrast, Soviet trucks struggled with mechanical brakes that failed in rain or snow, heavy cast iron pistons, crude settling tanks that barely worked, and engines that froze in the winter but overheated in summer. While the Arctic convoys captured the world's attention with their perilous battles against U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, the true lifeline of trucks flowed through the Persian corridor. The difference was not just in numbers, but in design philosophy. American trucks came with sealed wheel bearings that lasted 50,000 kilometers. Soviet bearings barely lasted 5,000, if they survived that long. The Americans shipped crates of spare parts with detailed catalogs, each part numbered and ready to order. Soviet mechanics were stunned. Their system was crude, strip-broken, vehicles for salvage or hand-forged replacement parts. American trucks even included features Soviet engineers had never considered important: safety glass, dual mirrors, backup lights, horns operable with one hand. To the Soviets, these seemed luxuries. In combat, they proved necessities. Beyond their immediate military impact, American trucks reshaped Soviet automotive thinking for decades. Engineers studied Studebakers and GMCs, learning principles they had never mastered: preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, standardized parts. Out of these lessons came the ZIS-150, the first Soviet post-war truck, in truth, little more than a Russian echo of American design. The transformation was total. Before the war, the Soviet Union's logistics failures had been catastrophic. In the Winter War of 1939, Soviet forces could not sustain operations even 150 kilometers from Leningrad against a Finnish army one-tenth their size. They lost 126,000 men dead and another 250,000 wounded, their offensives collapsing for lack of transport. By 1944, everything had changed. American trucks had erased the logistical weakness that once crippled the Red Army. In June of that year, the Soviets launched their decisive offensive against Finland, where their supply lines had broken in 1940. American vehicles now carried fuel, ammunition, and food across the same forests and marshes. The advance succeeded not because Soviet industry had overcome its flaws, but because American machines had filled the gap. Still, Soviet propaganda would insist that railways, not trucks, had been the backbone of victory. Yet declassified general staff studies, buried for decades, revealed why this was a lie. Railways could only deliver supplies to the rear depots. It was trucks, overwhelmingly American trucks, that carried the Red Army into Berlin. The Germans had learned the hard way what the Soviets were still trying to conceal. In their retreat, the Wehrmacht destroyed 65,000 kilometers of railway track, 13,000 bridges, and over 4,000 stations. Soviet railway troops worked heroically, but under combat conditions they could only restore 20 kilometers of track per day. Worse, repaired single-track lines could carry just 6 to 8 trains daily, compared to 40 or 50 on intact double-track routes. But the most critical flaw of railways was immovable. They ended at fixed points. The final 50 to 100 kilometers, the distance between depots and the front line, could only be bridged by trucks. Without trucks, the army starved. The Germans had discovered this truth fatally. Despite brilliant railway engineers, their lack of vehicles meant supplies piled up at railheads while frontline divisions ran out of ammunition. The Soviets avoided this fate only because of the flood of American vehicles. Studebakers became legends, but the truth was wider. More than 51,000 Willys Jeeps revolutionized reconnaissance and command. 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks gave infantry squads the tactical mobility they had never known. 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-tonners became the Red Army's dependable workhorses. Marshal Ivan Konev himself admitted, in private, that Jeeps transformed the tempo of Soviet command. For the first time, frontline generals could move between divisions in a single day, issue direct orders on the spot, and adapt to battle in real time. This accelerated command cycle gave the Soviets an edge that no railway could ever provide. And yet, even as these machines carried the Red Army toward Berlin, the Soviet state prepared to bury their memory. In February 1945, months before the guns fell silent, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order number 7572. Its purpose was simple: suppress all public acknowledgement of Lend-Lease. From 1945 onward, the truth was buried under layers of censorship. All photographs of foreign equipment were forbidden from publication. American Studebakers, Dodges, and Jeeps disappeared from the record, replaced in official images with crude brushstrokes of Soviet vehicles. Films showing American trucks were edited or destroyed. Veterans' memoirs were stripped of foreign references. Studebaker became simply truck. American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages were rewritten until memory itself was falsified. Even statistics were manipulated. The official Soviet history published in 1960 claimed Lend-Lease made up only 4% of wartime production, a number achieved through accounting tricks that compared American deliveries not to military needs, but to the total output of the Soviet economy, including civilian goods, and then deliberately undervalued American equipment in ruble terms. By 1948, the party line was clear. Nikolai Vosnesensky, a senior Politburo member, declared that Lend-Lease represented no more than 4% of Soviet effort, while simultaneously denouncing America as the leader of the so-called anti-camp. For 4 decades, this lie became unshakable orthodoxy. Historians who knew better faced a choice: repeat the myth or risk their careers, even their lives. Most chose silence. Generations of Soviet schoolchildren grew up believing their nation to have defeated Hitler essentially alone. Museums displayed captured German weapons but hid American vehicles. War memorials praised Soviet tanks and aircraft, but ignored the trucks that carried food, fuel, and shells to the front. In the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration proved beyond doubt that American trucks had transformed Soviet warfare. This colossal offensive destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, inflicted nearly 450,000 casualties, and rolled the Wehrmacht back in a way once thought impossible. The mathematics of the campaign told the story. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front required 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Soviet railways could deliver to depots 60 to 100 kilometers behind the front. Beyond that, only trucks could keep the advance moving. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of them American. The results were devastating for Germany. Soviet forces advanced 450 kilometers in just 5 weeks, a speed that shattered German assumptions. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet capability based on their own production numbers, believing the Red Army would need pauses every 100 kilometers to rebuild supply lines. What they had not accounted for was the tidal wave of American vehicles that had tripled Soviet transport capacity during Bagratión's 5 weeks of relentless advance. American trucks carried 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded. They burned through 67,000 tons of fuel that in many cases had itself been delivered by other American trucks. By comparison, Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained the offensive for even a single week. The contrast with earlier years was stark. In 1942, during the Second Battle of Kharkov, Soviet forces had outrun their supply lines within days, their offensive collapsing as logistics fell apart. By 1944, the situation had reversed. With American trucks, Soviet armies could maintain momentum for weeks, turning battlefield breakthroughs into strategic triumphs. Even Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, admitted this truth in private. 3 separate testimonies, hidden until the collapse of the USSR, demolished the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first came from KGB surveillance tapes. In 1963, unaware that his dacha was bugged, confessed, "People say the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we would have had nothing to pull our artillery with." The second testimony surfaced in interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966. Suppressed for decades, the recordings revealed Zhukov's blunt honesty about the decisive role of American aid. Marshal Zhukov, in his suppressed writings, admitted what official propaganda never could. "Without American Studebakers, we could not have moved our artillery to a considerable degree. They provided our frontline transport." His third testimony, hidden in an unpublished manuscript seized in 1969 and locked away until 1992, analyzed the Battle of Berlin itself. In it, he revealed that the delivery of 2.2 million artillery shells in just 2 weeks, a logistical miracle that shattered Germany's final defenses, had been possible only because of American trucks running continuous supply lines into the heart of the Reich. And Zhukov was not alone. Nikita Khrushchev's secret memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contained perhaps the most candid confession of all. Rarefied after the Soviet collapse, his voice carried no hesitation. "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had faced Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have withstood the pressure. We would have lost." Khrushchev was clear about what made the difference: trucks. No one speaks of this officially. Stalin left no record, but I can tell you, he admitted it more than once in private. Without American vehicles, our maneuverability would have been destroyed. Our losses would have been colossal. Yet the very same Khrushchev, as premier of the Soviet Union, would stand before the world and proclaim that victory had been achieved solely by Soviet strength. It was the ultimate contradiction, a schizophrenia of Soviet memory, where private admissions and public propaganda told 2 completely different stories. Meanwhile, the mechanics at the front lines knew the truth better than any politician. Every day, they worked on American trucks and marveled at their engineering. Aluminum pistons that saved weight and boosted performance. Oil filters that actually filtered engines that ran hot in winter and cool in summer. Against them, Soviet trucks looked like relics: heavy Castilian pistons, crude settling tanks, vehicles that broke down as often as they ran. The comparison was not just industrial, it was civilizational. Stretching 4,000 miles from American ports to the Soviet border, this route became one of the greatest logistical achievements of the entire war. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure almost overnight. They inherited a single-track railway that carried barely 200 tons a day and expanded its capacity to 6,000. They carved highways out of camel trails, and in the desert they built assembly plants capable of putting together 300 trucks every single day at Animashk, the largest of these plants. Soviet drivers would arrive after grueling journeys from the Caucasus. For 3 days, they trained on the strange new machines, learning systems and controls far beyond their own. Then they would climb behind the wheel and drive their brand new vehicles more than 1,800 miles back to the front. The cultural shock was immense. Soldiers who had grown up coaxing unreliable Soviet trucks back to life suddenly commanded vehicles that simply worked. By mid-1943, the Persian corridor was delivering thousands of trucks every month. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled only 50,000 tons annually before the war, was now processing a staggering 250,000 tons each month. Soviet liaison officers, stunned by the speed of American dockyards, reported ships unloaded in just 48 hours, tasks that Soviet ports often took 2 weeks to complete. Nearly half of all American trucks delivered to the Soviet Union came through Iran, making the corridor a vital artery of the war. And with those trucks came a deadly synergy. The marriage of American vehicles with Soviet rocket artillery produced one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield, a combination that would devastate German forces from Stalingrad to Berlin. The Soviet Union's feared BM-13 rocket launchers had first been mounted on the Z-6 truck, but when production of that vehicle ended in late 1941, the Red Army was left scrambling. Rail-mounted and towed versions of the launcher proved nearly useless in a war that demanded constant mobility. Then came the Studebaker US-6 and everything changed. The Studebaker's reinforced chassis could absorb the violent recoil of an entire rocket barrage. Its six-wheel drive allowed it to move swiftly across mud, snow, and shattered terrain, fire its deadly salvo, and relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived. By 1943, its performance was so decisive that the Soviets standardized the Katyusha on the Studebaker platform, officially designated the BM-13N. By war's end, more than 1,800 of these systems had been produced. The difference was survival. Guard formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas had survival rates 4 times higher than those still relying on Soviet vehicles. The shoot-and-scoot tactic, firing a full barrage and moving again within 3 minutes, depended entirely on reliable trucks. Soviet vehicles, when they worked at all, often required 15 minutes to achieve the same maneuver. A fatal delay under German fire. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers nicknamed the launchers Stalin's organs for the haunting scream of their rockets, but they also noted, with grim accuracy, that these terrifying weapons rode on American trucks beyond the battlefield. The shift to American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics. Standardization meant a single manual, one set of spare parts, and consistent training. Gone was the improvisation and chaos of earlier years. The numbers told the rest of the story. Soviet truck production throughout the war fell disastrously short. Just 46,000 vehicles in 1941, 32,000 in 1942, 41,000 in 1943, 57,000 in 1944, and 27,000 in 1945. Against the demands of a continent-sized war, these figures revealed a stark truth: without American trucks, a Soviet victory was mathematically impossible by the spring of 1945. The arithmetic of production told a story that Soviets never wanted to admit. Over the course of the war, Soviet factories managed to build just over 205,000 trucks. America delivered more than twice that number, minus 427,000 vehicles. Losses on the Eastern Front were staggering. In 1941 alone, nearly 300,000 trucks were destroyed or captured. By war's end, the Red Army had lost more than 500,000 vehicles. Without American deliveries, the Soviet motor pool would have collapsed entirely by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive launched after Stalingrad rolled forward on American wheels. By the time Soviet troops reached Berlin, American vehicles made up only a third of the Red Army's fleet, yet they provided more than 70% of its transport capacity thanks to their superior strength, reliability, and load-bearing power. The economic reality was equally decisive. In 1943, a single Studebaker US-6 cost just $1,830 to produce. Through Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union received them for free. To build an equivalent vehicle at home would have cost the USSR precious industrial resources worth nearly $800 million. In $1,943 resources it could not spare without halting tank and aircraft production. More critically, it was capacity the Soviet economy simply did not have. And yet, with this lifeline secured, the Red Army was preparing its greatest blow. On June 23, 1944, Operation Bagration would begin the massive offensive that would annihilate Germany's Army Group Center and shatter the Wehrmacht's strength forever. It was only with Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost that the truth finally began to surface. In 1989, the Military History Journal published the transcripts of the Tehran Conference, revealing Stalin's own admission that without American aid, the USSR would have lost the war. The reaction was explosive. Readers realized their entire understanding of victory was built on lies. By 1990, veterans finally spoke openly. At a Moscow reunion, aged drivers stood before their comrades and told the truth: how they had lived, fought, and survived inside American trucks. Stories hidden for 45 years now echoed across halls where propaganda once reigned. Archival revelations confirmed it all. Historians uncovered the dual bookkeeping system: one set of figures for internal planning, another set for propaganda. The truth had always been there, locked away. The Red Army had not marched to Berlin on Soviet steel alone. It had rolled forward on American wheels. The archives, once opened, told the truth that propaganda had buried. By 1945, American trucks made up 70% of the Soviet Union's transport capacity. Historian Boris Sokolab, examining the real figures, put it bluntly: remove American trucks from the equation, and every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad collapses. The Red Army marched to Berlin wearing American boots and riding on American trucks. The Battle of Berlin itself revealed this dependency in its starkest form, supplying 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and more than 41,000 artillery pieces across the wreckage of Germany demanded a logistical miracle, 20,000 tons of supplies every single day for Zhukov's first Belarusian front alone. His fleet of 22,000 trucks included 16,000 American-built vehicles. The artillery alone consumed 2.5 million shells in the first week. Delivering that firepower required American trucks running day and night under fire, each averaging, for supply runs per day, 100 kilometers round trip. Soviet trucks, when they ran at all, managed one, even in their greatest moment of triumph. The Red Army's victories rolled forward on American wheels. The irony could not have been greater. In May 1945, the Red Army staged its victory parade. In Berlin, the most presentable, most reliable vehicles on display were not Soviet, they were American. Stalin's soldiers conquered Hitler's capital riding Roosevelt's trucks. When the full accounting of Lend-Lease aid was finally revealed after the Soviet collapse, the numbers were staggering. 427,000 trucks and jeeps, 13,300 combat vehicles, over 35,000 motorcycles, more than 2,300 service vehicles, 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15 million pairs of boots, nearly 2,000 locomotives, more than 11,000 rail cars. The vehicle deliveries alone exceeded all truck production by Germany during the entire war, enough to fully motorize 60 rifle divisions. By war's end, American vehicles had carried 60% of Soviet ammunition, hauled 70% of its fuel, evacuated 65% of its wounded, and towed nearly 60% of its artillery. That in the immediate post-war years, some Soviet officials, even Marshal Zhukov himself, proposed monuments to honor this aid, a memorial to the arsenal of democracy. The Communist Party rejected them all. For 45 years there would be no monument, no plaque, no acknowledgement. Only in 2004 did a modest memorial to Lend-Lease appear in Murmansk, and even then, it was mired in controversy. The absence of monuments reflected something deeper, the theft of historical memory. Generations of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation had defeated Hitler alone, but the veterans remembered. At a gathering in Moscow in 2005, the surviving drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood to preserve the truth. They brought photographs hidden for 6 decades, showing American trucks painted with Soviet stars, and they left behind a final statement, signed by 200 men who had lived it. We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. This is not to diminish the sacrifice of our people. 27 million died, but truth honors their memory better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland. Today, as Russia once again rewrites World War II history for political purposes, the story of Lend-Lease carries new weight. Modern textbooks in Moscow downplay American aid even more than the Soviets once did, part of a campaign to rebuild pride on myths rather than facts. But the mathematics cannot be erased. 427,284 American vehicles crossed oceans to reach the Soviet Union, more than twice the entire Soviet truck production of the war. That truth sits in the archives, beyond denial. And the words of Stalin, Khrushchev and Zhukov, preserved in secret files and memoirs, remain unshakable testimony. This is not just the story of trucks, it is the story of how international cooperation, not isolation, defeated fascism. How industrial democracy, with its immense productive power, gave a struggling ally the mobility to fight across continents. How ideology bent history, but could not break it. Those Studebakers the Red Army nicknamed Zakhar Ivanovich, the go-anywhere. Trucks were as essential to victory as the T-34 tanks etched into every Soviet memorial. They carried men, ammunition, fuel, and hope. They transformed the Red Army from a force tethered to railways and horses into a mechanized juggernaut capable of sustained offensives. Soviet leaders knew this. Stalin admitted, in Tehran, without American machines, we would have lost the war. Zhukov confessed, without American trucks, we would have had nothing to pull our artillery with. Khrushchev recalled, if the United States had not helped us, we could not have withstood German pressure. Yet for 45 years, the truth was buried. Photos were doctored, memoirs censored, statistics falsified. An entire generation grew up believing victory had been achieved alone. Only with glasnost did the truth finally emerge from archives, recordings, and the voices of veterans who had waited a lifetime to speak freely. The verdict was clear. American aid didn't just help, it enabled victory. Without it, there would have been no Red Army in Berlin, no final triumph. And so, the lesson goes beyond military history. It shows how authoritarian regimes manipulate memory, how political necessity overrides accuracy, and how truth eventually pushes through, like steel wheels grinding forward against resistance. Because in the end, those Studebakers outlasted the lies told about them. Veterans remembered, documents proved, history recorded. The arsenal of democracy defeated the Wehrmacht not only with guns, but with wheels, 427,284 of them. The final irony. American generosity helped create the very Soviet superpower that would spend decades denying the truth of that aid. Yet, truth, like those reliable American engines, endures. The Soviet generals were right. Without 400,000 American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory. The wheels of democracy carried the Red Army and the free world to victory over tyranny.